So this week we're going to be covering XML and JSON. And most of you have had the 190 class already where we covered both XML and JSON, but it was more client side. So, uh, accessing the data and kind of manually creating files and interfacing with APIs, that kind of thing. And so what we're going to do today is kind of review what you know about XML and JSON, and then we're actually going to be retrieving the data from the database and creating XML files and creating the JSON files, very similar to what a company would do for developers who are accessing the data. Okay, so you're basically going to get to see the other side of it today. And we'll go through the XML, and then I'm going to ask you guys if you want to go through the JSON today or if you want to wait until Wednesday, because I'm pretty flexible. There's a lot of information. So if you're starting to feel overloaded, we certainly can, wait. Otherwise, we can go through everything today. This is the last little bit of information that we need to cover in this class. All right. So this is in chapter 28 in that book that you have. The files that we're going to be using are in this zip download, so you can have all of the files. And so we start by talking about XML. And so basically, both XML and JSON are considered document storage. They're text-based, and they're pretty popular because you can store large amounts of data, and you can change the data, and the actual pages that access that data don't have to change. Let's see. So we'll talk about XML first, then we're going to talk about JSON. And as I said, I'm going to check to make sure you guys want to continue. Otherwise, we'll finish on Wednesday. So for XML, I happen to love XML because it's a language that you basically make up, which I think is kind of awesome. So you make up the tags. So it's kind of like HTML because there's tags, there's opening and closing tags, but you make them up. Okay, and it's kind of in a tree structure. It's hierarchical. So here we have an example. There's an opening note tag, closing note tag, and then in between, we have a to tag, a from tag, a heading tag, and a body tag. And this is kind of mimicking a memo, basically. Okay, so these are all made up tags. Let's see, XML was really, really popular. I'm seeing more files now in JSON than XML, but XML is still popular. And both languages just use plain text files. So you could actually open the raw file on the browser and read through it. So basically, it's got this little hierarchical tree structure. And the very first tag is called the root. So in this little example, note is the root. And in this little example, bookstore is the root. Okay, and then one level down from the root, you have a child element. So we have book and we have to. So book is a child of bookstore. To is a child of note. Okay, and in our note structure, that's all we have. We just have like the root, which is the parent, and we have a child. And then at that same level as to, we have from, heading, and body. So those are all children of note, and they are siblings to each other. And then in bookstore, we have a third level. So we have bookstore, we have book, which is a child, to bookstore. So bookstore is the parent. And then below book, we have title, author, year, and price. Those are all children of book, grandchildren of bookstore. Okay. And title, author, year, and price are siblings to each other. And in XML, the indentation is kind of important because it helps you see the relationships. It's easier to see them. As far as the syntax rules go, you do need to have opening and closing tags. At the very top of the document, you should have this tag. And this is for the browser. So it basically tells the web browser you're using XML and the encoding is UTF-8. Okay, so it just tells the browser what kind of file it's dealing with. Let's see. The tags are case sensitive, so that is something that you're going to want to remember. When I create tags, I will either do them all lowercase or all uppercase. You can see that these are all lowercase. I've done them all uppercase. I try to do the exact same within a document, and I tend to do lowercase just because it's easier to type. I don't have to press shift. And I am a lazy typist, so the tags are case sensitive. They have to be properly nested, so the nesting rules are the same as HTML. So it's basically last in, first out. So we've got tag 1 and tag 2. Tag 2 is the last one in. So when you're closing, tag 2 has to be the first one out. So the root element is required, which means you have to have some kind of parent, okay? So note in this case, bookstore in this case, you have to have a root element. So that would be the one that's at the top. XML does allow attributes. In this little example, date is an attribute. In this little example, category is an attribute. Now, could the attribute simply be another tag? Yeah, it could. And quite often people will pull out attributes and make them tags. So, it's kind of up to you if you want it to be an attribute or a tag when you're designing your file. XML does have reserved words. And so you really can't use their reserved words as tags with text between them. It's not going to like that. For special characters, you do need to use the HTML equivalent. So less than, greater than, the ampersand, apostrophe, double quote. These are all the HTML equivalents of those symbols. And if you want to add comments in XML, you just use the HTML syntax for comments. Okay, so that's the angle bracket, exclamation, dash, dash, whatever your comment text is, dash, dash, angle bracket. One difference between XML and HTML is that it does preserve your spaces. In HTML, it ignores them, but XML, it does preserve your spaces, and that's mainly so that you can create this visual hierarchy or tree. When you are creating XML elements, you do have to pay a little attention to the syntax rules, or the file that you create is going to have errors. You do need the opening and closing tags. Within an element, you can have another element, so you can nest your elements. You can have text, you can have attributes, okay, or a mixture. If you are creating an element that doesn't contain any content, you can kind of combine the opening and the closing as an opening with a slash at the end. Would I do it that way in code? No, I wouldn't. I would just do an opening and closing with nothing inside. Because your code is probably going to be in some kind of loop, and exceptions aren't easier to code. So I would just not have anything in there, inside there, if something didn't exist. Naming rules. The names can contain letters, numbers, and other characters. They can't start with a number or a punctuation mark. They cannot start with the letters XML in any form, and they can't contain spaces. So what is typically used instead of a space is either camel casing, where you do all lowercase and you use a capital letter for the second word, or they often use underscores. So the first word, underscore, second word. XML tags are pretty descriptive, so that you basically can read through the file and tell what it's storing. Uh, if you are tempted to use dashes instead of underscores between words, they tell you to avoid that. The reason is that some browsers may interpret that as a minus sign. They also tell you to avoid dots because in object property notation, you do the object dot property, and so you don't want it to misinterpret your tag name as an object and a property. And then they want you to avoid colons because colons are reserved for namespaces. If you ever have to code internationally, non-English letters are fine in XML. Okay, it's the software that might not support them, but XML does not have a problem with it. XML is extensible, so it can carry more information. You can extend the language. We've already talked about the best practices for naming variables. What we haven't talked about is a namespace. So if you're working on a project and you're creating XML files and other people are creating XML files, naming collisions are pretty common, especially if you're storing things like dates and titles and that kind of thing. So to make your element names unique, you put them in a namespace. And the namespace does not actually have to exist. It is made up too. So in your root tag, you add an attribute for an XML namespace. And you basically set it to a fictitious web address. And that's all you have to do to create a namespace. Okay, so it assigns kind of this fictitious spot. It assigns all of these values to that fictitious spot. Okay, so you can totally make up a namespace, and that's really all you have to do to avoid naming collisions. And the only real errors that you're probably going to get in XML would maybe be typos, like you have some kind of a typo in your opening or closing tag. Perhaps you forgot the tag at the top that tells it that it is an XML file, that kind of thing. Typically, if you open XML files in browsers, you can actually see that whole layout, and it looks very similar to this. You're not going to see it formatted because it's a data storage system. Now, there is a language that formats XML documents. It's XSLT. That is its own language. So if you go to W3 Learn, you can actually learn all about XSLT. For us, if we're going to read in an XML file using PHP, we're just going to format it with HTML. So that's kind of an overview on XML itself. Do you guys have any questions about that?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay. We're going to now talk about XML and PHP. So if we have an XML file and we want to pull it in using PHP, there's two ways you can do it. You can use something called a simple XML parser, or you can use the PHP XML DOM parser. The simple XML parser is easier because you don't need knowledge of the DOM or JavaScript. So that is the one that we're going to look at because this class does not have a prereq of CIT 190. So I think all of you have had CIT 190, but I can't really assume that. So simple XML is what we're going to use, and it is pretty easy. So it's built into PHP, started with version 5, and we're now on version 7 something. And you can basically access XML data with just a couple lines of code. And what it does is it converts the XML data into either an associative array or objects. And the syntax here is simple XML load file, and then you have to give it the actual file that you're loading. And then, or die, can't create an object. And then you're storing the result in a PHP variable. So here I've got an XML file called Santa's List. Okay, and I am storing that in a variable called XML list. Okay. And if we're talking about nodes in XML, a node is an element. So Christmas list is a node. Child is a node. Status is a node. Okay. So a node is just an element. So here is Santa's list. Here is our PHP code that is going to basically read in the first child. Okay, so we take Santa's list, load it into our PHP variable. Okay, and then you'll notice we have arrow notation where we're accessing child. Then we're accessing status. And we're basically displaying what is inside the status tags. And then we're doing the same thing for name. So it's XML list, child, and name. So we're displaying what's between the opening and closing name. We do the same thing with age and request. And then this is what the output looks like. So by default, if you do something like this, all you're going to get is the first one. So to access everything that's in the file, you have to use some kind of a loop. And if you use a for each loop, that ensures that you will access everything that's in the file automatically. So it starts out the same, okay, where we use simple XML load file, and we throw that into a variable. Then we use for each, and we take the variable that contains the file, and because the structure of this file has everything inside child. So between every opening and closing child is all the data that we want. You'll notice that in the for each, we have XML list, arrow, child. Okay, and then we give that a little alias, and the alias is list. So list represents basically the Christmas list and child. Okay, so when we say list, we're looking at Christmas list and child, and then we just need an arrow, and the element that contains the data. So when we have arrow status, it's coming in here and it's grabbing nice. We have arrow name, it's grabbing Susie Luhu. Okay. Arrow age, grabbing her age. Arrow request, grabbing her Christmas request. Okay, we're storing those in variables. And then you'll notice we have an echo where we are throwing out a div tag with a width. And we've got a paragraph with some styling in here. And we've got a little heading called status. And then we're printing out our status variable and got some styling, got a heading called name, printing out the name that we saved, printing out age and request. And this is what it looks like. Okay, and then here's another little example. So this is famous chocolate manufacturers. Okay, so our root up here is chocolate. And then all of our data is in between the opening and closing manufacturer tags. Okay, that's where all the data that we want to access is located. Okay, so if we're going to write a little script to access this file, we're going to use a simple XML load file. This time it's a chocolate XML file, and we're saving that in our list variable. And this time our for each is going to be XML list arrow manufacturer, because inside the opening and closing manufacturer tags is where everything is located that contains the data that we want to display. Okay, and we're giving that an alias of yum. So in our name variable, we've got yum arrow name, founder, yum arrow founder. So what it's going to do is it's going to grab Godiva. It's going to grab Joseph Drapp's 1920s. For country, it's going to grab Brussels, Belgium. Okay, and then we've got the echo that prints the stuff out. And this is what it looks like. Okay, so that's all about reading those files. If you are going to create an XML file, you will need a script that creates it, and then you're going to want a script that reads it. So I actually have a script that created a contact list, and that is reading from the list, not a whole lot in there. So if I do view contact, it's going to have the same thing. Okay, so the procedure to create the contact list file is actually very similar to the procedure that we've been using. We have to connect to the database. We have to place a query into a variable, and then we use MySQLi query, which is exactly what we've been doing. Okay, and then we're going to use a while loop with MySQLi fetch array to access each record. And then inside the loop, we're going to be actually creating the XML elements and kind of writing to a string. And then we end up converting that string into an XML element or variable. And then we write that to a file. It's kind of the procedure. So this is an entire file that will create a contact list. So looking at this, we've got our MySQLi statement, which is how we're going to connect to the database. Then we are saying, or actually it is connecting to the database. Then we are checking to see if there's an error. And if there is no error, then we've got our little select. We query it. This is the result. And then we start our variable that is going to contain all of our XML. So the root of this XML file is contact list. Okay, so that's going to be like the parent. And then you'll notice we have a loop, and then below the loop, we add in the closing contact list. Okay, so we have the opening one, we have the closing one, and in between, we're getting our data. So here we've got MySQL Live Fetch Array, and we are basically converting the results into an associative array. And when you read data from your SQL database and you convert it into associative array, your column names become the keys. Okay, so the associative array here is named R. And then if we want to access anything inside that array, we have to use our columns. So the column ID, F name, L name, date added, date modified, those are all column names. So we get into this loop, we create address. Address is a child to contact list, and it is going to be a parent to ID, first, last, add date, and modified date. And you'll notice that there's a closing address down here at the bottom. So we've got the opening address, we got the closing address, that's the parent, and then we have all of these children who are siblings to each other. So we have the opening ID, then we concatenate in whatever's stored in the array for ID. And then we do the closing ID. Then we do the opening first. We go into that associative array at first name and grab that. And then we do a closing first. Opening last, subscript into the associative array with last name, add the closing last. And then we do the same thing for add date and modified date. So that is how we are creating the file. Now at this point, the entire file is in this XML variable. So this next statement, we're done creating the file. Now we actually have to convert it into an XML file. And that is what this statement does. Okay, and we store the converted one in this variable. And then we take this variable and we use as XML, and we actually write the file and we give it a name. So we're going to be calling it context.xml. This is writing the file. And then because we're good coders, we are displaying to the users that that file has been created. And then we give them a link to view the file. Okay, and I can see down here, I meant to switch this out. I just ran out of time this morning, but so this is example. It's called view context, but you can see it's showing the address XML file instead of the contact XML file. Okay, but all of the data in it is pretty much the same. So we'll just pretend that that says context.xml. Assuming this is context.xml, we're loading that into XML list, okay? And then it's going to address. And remember, we have the XML list portion is really for that root. And then we're grabbing address, which is the parent. And so those two things together, we are giving an alias here of address. So then to grab what's in ID first, last, add date, modified date, it's just a matter of taking that address alias, using the arrow, and then giving it the node or the element that we want to access. So ID first, last, add date, modified date, store those. And then we kind of format a little echo statement to display them. So this is the process for creating the XML and reading it. In your final project, you will either need to do this, or you're going to have to create a JSON file and access that. Do you guys have any questions about the XML process? Are you guys ready to move on to JSON, or do you want to wait till Wednesday? I don't know what silence means. You guys are going to have to communicate with me. Are you ready to move forward? Okay. Cole votes for keep. He wants to keep going. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes, that's fine with me.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. All right. So I'm seeing thumbs up, hearing affirmatives. So we will move forward. All right. So the other document storage technique you can use is JSON, which is JavaScript Object Notation. It's a really popular alternate to XML because it doesn't use tags, and it's kind of an offshoot from JavaScript. So for front-end developers, it's extremely popular because you don't have to parse it or anything. JavaScript recognizes it. So when you're doing data storage, JSON typically stores data in an array because you're going to have, multiple rows of data. And so here's an example of a JSON array. The name of the array is employees. And then you can see that we've got several rows of data. You could look at them as objects. You could also look at them as rows or records. So this is how JSON would code employees, and this is how XML would code the same thing. So you can see how much more space XML takes up, which is part of the reason why JSON is more popular. Similarities, they're both text, they're both self-describing, which means you can pretty much look and see what they're storing. They're both hierarchical, and they can both be used with web programming languages. Differences, the JSON code doesn't use tags, and it's shorter, and it actually runs a little bit quicker. You can also use the arrays, and that is typically how the JSON data is stored. It's quite often stored in arrays. And it doesn't need to be parsed to actually access the data. So a little review of syntax rules. So if you're going to code or create a JSON file, the data has to be in name value pairs, and the data is separated by commas. Curly braces is used to hold objects, and square brackets is used to hold arrays. So looking at this little example here, we've got square brackets, so we know that we have an array. And we've got curly braces, so we have 3 objects here. And then we've got the name and a colon and the value. And then you can see there's comma between. And because we have multiple objects here, there's a comma after each one except for the last one. The last one does not require a comma, and if you put one in, you'll have a hard time reading the data because it's technically an error. Let's see, JSON values can be a number, a string, Boolean, an array, or an object, or even null. Okay, so it works pretty well with our MySQL data. We're going to pull data from a table because those values kind of correspond to what we typically would put in our different columns within a table. This first little example is not an array. We've just got a couple different name value pairs. So even though JSON uses JavaScript syntax, you can work with it using PHP. So if you do have a JSON file, you can't just read it in like you do in JavaScript. You actually have to encode the file or decode the file. And so if you are going to use it with PHP, then let's see if I can show you an example. If you want to read it, you have to use JSON decode. Okay, and then you give it the name of the JSON file. And the second parameter, the default is false. And that means that it returns an object. Now, if you put true here, then it's going to return an associative array. And they're handled very similar. Okay, so in PHP, we're handling the objects and the associative arrays very similar. But this little example shows some name value pairs, and we're storing it in a JSON variable. And then we're using printr to show you kind of the difference. So here's printr with JSON decode, and you'll notice that we have true, so this is going to be an associative array. And then here we have printr with JSON decode, and we don't have true, which means it's basically printing out an object. And you can see this is the output. It says array. For the second one, it says that it's an object. But if you look at how it's stored, it's basically stored the same way. And to access data within the array, you subscript in. And to access data within the object, you use something called array notation. And so what that looks like, here's that same JSON variable with the name value pairs. Here we've got decode using true, which means we have an associative array. And so we're subscripting in with the name portion of the name value pair. So name, status, age, that's what we're using to subscript in. When we are accessing an object, we're using the array notation, which is not a subscript. Instead, it's an arrow. So here we've got JSON decode, and we're storing it in my object. And so then we're using my object with an arrow, and then name, my object with an arrow, and status, my object arrow age. Okay, so instead of subscripting in, we've got the arrow. Results are going to be the same. Okay, so whether you decode as an associative array or an object, it's totally up to you, whichever one you are more comfortable with. To me, I'm more used to working with the associative arrays, so I would probably do it this way. But it's perfectly fine to have it an object and use that array notation with that. So if you have multiple rows, then you're probably going to want to use a for each loop. So with a for each loop, we still have to use JSON decode. And here, the name of the file is JSON data. We are not specifying a second parameter, which means we're going to get an object. And we have for each. So the name of the object is PHP array. As we have key value pairs. So we're going to call the key, and we're going to call the value. Okay, so in our echo, you'll notice that we're echoing key and we're echoing value. So what that does is it displays user and Scooby-Doo. And then it goes to the next one and displays age and 10. Then it goes to the next one, country, and displays United States. That's the value. Okay, so you can see how that prints. Here is a longer example. So we're back to looking at chocolate. And this is a PHP variable called chocolates. And then you can see that I did my little tricky thing by putting single quotes around the whole thing so that I could use double quotes inside. And so the name of the array is manufacturer. And then I've got several different objects in here. I've got a little heading that I'm displaying, and then I'm using decode. And because I do like the associative arrays better, I did put true, and then I stored it as chocolate array. And then in order to access, directly access name, founder, country, that kind of thing, I said chocolate array and gave it a subscript of manufacturer that has an alias of yum so that I can just subscript directly into yum with name, founder, and country. Okay, and then store those values and display them. So if you wanted to see that live, that is how it looks. Okay, and so this is primarily the code used to create that. The CSS has some styling in the background image and that kind of thing in it. So we use JSON decode to allow us to access the data that's in the file using PHP. If we want to create a file using data from our database, then we're going to use JSON encode because that will convert it into a JSON format. Okay, and typically we do that in a string, and then we actually have to write to file, and we use the fwrite command to actually write it to the file. So here we've got our print string, or you could call it a write string. We've got JSON encode, we've got the name of the array and any options. So the array name is the value that you're encoding. The options. So these are all the different ways that you can encode that data, or you can just leave it blank. So we're probably just going to be leaving it blank. Although the JSON pretty print is nice because it'll write the file in a very nice format that you can easily read. So here's a little array. Okay, and it's an associative array. And then you can see that I just encode it. Okay, and I'm echoing that array encoded. And so this is what it looks like. Here's an example of objects. So I've got code here that is creating an object. And this is how I would encode that. So child is my object, and that is what I pass along. So if I wanted to actually take child and write it into a file, then I have to use the fwrite command. And file handling requires 3 commands because you have to open the file, then you have to write the file, then you have to close the file. And so we're using fopen, fwrite, and fclose. Those happen to be C programming language commands, C and C++ commands. Okay, so that's where they originated. So if you're familiar with those languages, then this is going to seem very familiar. And if you're not familiar with those languages, this is pretty much how you create files. Okay, and it's more done in C, although because C++ is kind of an offshoot of C, C++ includes all of C commands. But fopen basically opens the file. Okay, so you have fopen, you give it the name or the web address of the file, and then you have to give it an access method. An access method is simply how you're going to open the file. Am I going to write a file? And if that's the case, you'd give it a W. And this is for a brand new file. If the file exists, it will be replaced. Okay, A is to append data. So if the file exists, great, it just adds data to the bottom. A plus will append the data if the file is there. If the file is not there, it will create the file. Okay, and so you give it the name of the file and how you're going to open it, WA or A plus, and then that gets stored in a file pointer. Okay, so here I've got a file called JSON dinner. I'm opening it for writing, and I'm storing basically the pointer is the location in memory where that file is. So I'm storing that in my file. Fwrite. It will write the contents of the string to the file stream associated with the file variable that you created with fopen. So it uses the pointer so that it knows where to write the file. And the print string is basically what you get when you're reading from your database and you are creating those name value pairs. Okay, once you're done creating the name value pairs, you're going to encode it, store that encoded data in a string, and the print string is the encoded data. Okay, that's what it is. So here we've got the JSON dinner. We're opening it for writing. We have our print string. You can see we've got JSON encode and the string that we're encoding that we've created and we're encoding is dinner. And then we've got fwrite. The file pointer is my file, and the string that we're going to write is print string. So again, the file pointer is pointing to you to the location in memory where you're going to actually write the file to, and the print string is what you are writing. So this is kind of like the where, and this is the what. And once you are done writing the file, then you're going to close it. And that's just fclose, and then you've got your file pointer. So, example of creating a JSON file from a PHP array. So I have a PHP array. It's an external file, and I'm pulling it into the program using an include. Okay, and this external file looks something like this. Okay, so this is just like a portion of it. You can see it's got an opening PHP, but there's probably a lot more there, and at the bottom it has a closing. Okay, so I'm including that. Then I have my file, which is a pointer. I am opening the JSON dinner file for writing. Then I encode it, and I have a print string variable, which I then physically write to file. And then because I'm a good developer, I display a message that the JSON dinner file is being created, and then I close the file. So this is an example of how that looks when it runs. Not very fancy. And so this little script is going to read that dinner file that was created right here. So the little script, you can see that we've got file get contents, JSON dinner. We're going to decode it, and I've got true, so it's going to be an associative array. I've got a heading that I am displaying, or I'm storing in the display variable. And then I've got a for each, and that will ensure that I get all of the data. And I'm adding to my display string. And so you can see that I've got the entree, the description, the price, and the calories. And it's going to loop through and do that for multiple items. Okay, and that's pretty much all I need to do to create a display. So if you want to see that, that is what it looks like. And obviously there's CSS in the background kind of making it look pretty. So you guys have any questions so far? What we've been looking at is basically reading from kind of a hard-coded file, JSON file, and writing that, or pulling that in and writing that to file. And what we're going to cover next is how to read a SQL file. Okay, so I'm seeing thumbs up, so good. Okay, awesome. So to create a JSON file using SQL data, obviously you have to connect to the database. Okay, you have to format your query to retrieve the records. Then you're going to have some kind of a select statement to retrieve that data. You're going to store the result. And you're going to create two different array variables. The post array is going to store the data from the SQL request in an associative array, and the response array is going to include the name of the array, and it includes all of the post array information. So we're going to give it a key value, and then we will add the post key value pairs to it. And this is what's going to get encoded by the JSON parser. We're going to have a while loop that processes the results. It's going to look something like this. And then we're going to retrieve the column information, and we're going to store that in variables. And we're going to add the variables that are stored from the database to our post array. And that will look something like this. So here's our post array. And then we have the manufacturer, the founder, the city, state, and country. We're going to add that post array to the response variable with a key value because it is associative array. And in the example we're going to look at, the key value is chocolatier. Once we have all of that, we're going to open up the JSON file using fopen, opening it for writing, which means if it exists, we're going to write over the top of it. We're going to use fwrite with JSON encode to create the file, and then we're going to use fclose. So here is our code. So we do our connection. Our query is going to be to select everything from products. And then we've got a result where we take the query or the results of the query and we store them. Then we've got a response variable that is going to store an array, and we have a post variable that's going to store an array. We take the result, which we got up here from executing that query, And we use fetch associative to convert that into an associative array, and we store that in row. And then we're filling up some variables. So we have manufacturer, we're subscripting into row with manufacturer, storing it, subscripting into row with founder, storing it, subscripting in with city, storing it, state, storing it, and country, storing that as well. Okay, and then we have a post array, which we're filling in. And so we have our key and our value, our key and our value, our key and our value, key and value, key and value. And those values we got from here. So this loop is filling in this array. Okay, now this array in itself is not really going to be properly formed because we need a name for all of those rows that are in that array. And so once we get out of this loop, what this post array has is it's basically got a bunch of arrays that have data in them. And so we have to assign that a name. And so the name is going to be chocolatier. So we created this empty response array up here. So now we are giving that a key and putting all of the posts into that. Okay, and so at this point, post is filled in and response is filled in. Okay, so we created the empty ones here and we filled them in. Now we need to create the file. So we have fopen. The name of our file is chocolate.json. Now this assumes that the location of this file is going to be in the exact same folder as this program. Okay, because we haven't specified a different location. And we are opening it for writing, which means if it exists, it's going to be destroyed and it's going to put a new one out there. Okay, and then this is our file pointer. And then we are going to write the file. So we're giving it the file pointer, which is the location, the physical location in memory where it's going to write this file. And then we're using JSON encode, and we're encoding our response array. Okay, and that actually takes this associative array and it converts it into a JSON file. And that is what is getting written to memory. Okay, and it's associating the name JSON chocolate with it. And then once it's done, it's closing the file pointer. And then because we're good coders, we are basically going to tell them that the file has been written and we're giving them a little link to view it. Okay, so that is all of the code. So to run that code, all we do is click on this. And it should say that it's been written. We can view it this way. And we can also view it this way. Okay, and this is the raw code. And you can see how it put chocolatier here for the name of the array. Okay, and then we basically have objects here. So each one of these, even though they're like little arrays, in JSON, they're considered objects. Now you might wonder, well, how come it's not vertical? Well, we did not give it the parameter to make it pretty. So if you remember when we looked at that code, they had all sorts of parameters that I said were optional, wherever those are. I think they're way up here. Yeah. So when you encode, all that's really required is the name. And then they've got all of these options. And I said probably the only one you might want to use is the JSON pretty print option. That would make it vertical and kind of nice to read. Okay. But it's really not necessary. Okay. It will create the file just fine without it. Okay. So you don't really have to do it that way, you know, unless you wanted to see the difference in how it looks. Okay. So that was creating it. As far as reading from that file that I just showed you here, this is the actual code used to read from that file. It's similar to the code that we've been looking at. So the name of the file is chocolate.json. We're using file get contents, storing it, have my little heading. That's not it. Let me get, so world's top chocolatiers is the heading. Then we've got, let's see, chocolate object. So here I am decoding it as an object, not an associative array. Then I've got a for each, chocolate object dash chocolatier. So chocolatier is the name of the array. So I basically, let me show you that array again. So I don't want to have to prefix everything with that. I want to just be able to go in and grab the data for manufacturer, founder, all of that. So if I include chocolate object arrow chocolatier here, give it an alias of yum, then I can just grab manufacturer, grab founder, grab country without prefixing everything with chocolatier. Okay, so yum basically represents chocolate object arrow chocolatier. Okay, so I'm grabbing the data, storing it, and displaying it or adding to the display string. Okay, so for your assignment, you're going to do a JSON or an XML file. It's your choice. So you're going to retrieve data from one of your final project SQL database tables. I don't care which one. Okay. You are going to create an XML or a JSON file. You're going to create a script to read the XML or JSON file and display the data. You should have a command up on your project menu to create the file, and then another command to read the file. And then you want those files in your final project folder. Okay, so that is this assignment, which also counts for your final project. Okay, so you're kind of double dipping. You guys have any questions?
I'm good on that.
Okay. So I'm going to stop the recording. And then if you guys have questions about anything else or problems, you can ask. One thing before I stop the recording, one thing I've already been asked is for the authentication for the auth user table, the ID is not set up for auto increment. You can make it auto increment if you want, or you can assign IDs. If you're going to assign IDs, one way to do it would be to retrieve the number of rows and just add one to it, okay, which is kind of like auto increment. Or you could do something like we did with CAPTCHA, where you're generating kind of random numbers that way. It's totally up to you. There's all sorts of different ways to randomize values for IDs. So auto increment might be easier. So if you want to change it to auto increment, that's fine. Okay, totally up to you. So now I am going to stop the recording. And then you guys, if you have questions or problems, you can share your screen. Feel free to ask.